All right, it's been a while. I'm gonna do coffee scoop. This is what the scoop looks like after about 5 minutes. As you can see, I like to have a handle that's upswept so that when you go to pick it up, the handle is nice and up towards you. And that also gives you a certain amount of crank so that when you're down at the bottom of the canister scooping out, it just naturally wants to sort of level off and pick up stuff. So if anyone has any questions or topics they'd like me to talk about, it doesn't have to be about this scoop. It's been a while since I've done a live video, and I wanted to throw myself open to you guys and see what you want to know. It's always easier for me to talk in response to your answers than in response to your questions than to type on that tiny screen. So it's nice to be here. All right. I just sharpened my knives. Usually I sharpen my knives on Sunday, but this Sunday, I forget what I was doing. Too busy to sharpen knives. And then yesterday I had a spoon carving lesson, and so today I'm back to carving. So I just spent maybe 30 minutes giving all of my straight knives a once over. And I didn't bother doing my hook because I felt like I hadn't really done all that much work. So you can see I go around the outside first. I always make myself do the bowl first because it's generally harder than the handle, although the handles on these scoops can be just as tricky. But on longer spoons, the handle is always sort of the long, fun bit. And so I've long trained myself to do the bowl of everything first so that it gets done before the handle becomes too delicate. So I start off with the bowl, and then I do the handle, and then I do these little shoulder connections. It shouldn't take very long. Hi, Tucker. And hello to whoever that was that said hello back there. Like I said, guys, if anyone has questions about any part of the process or anything, really, it doesn't have to be about carving, feel free to holler it out. Otherwise, I'll just keep nattering on about what I'm working on. So to get these little indentations here that I do on my scoops, this is not the best knife to do it because this knife actually has a slightly wider tip. You can see there how this knife is narrower, and that's because this one has the wider bevel. And so in the process of widening the bevel, it creates a wider tip. So in the end, I'll switch to one of these knives that still has the narrow classic Mora tip. But in the meantime, I'll just go back and forth. Now, because this is so much wider than it will be in the end, there's no point in trying to get it really perfect. How long have I been carving? I've been carving probably about 4 years, and 2 years ago I quit a summer job that I had and really pursued carving seriously and started carving. Hey Willow, that's enough. You don't need to be barking. And started carving every day, and things have only been picking up steam since then. Hey Matt. Hey Daniel. So I just roughly get these indentations here, and it's mostly just a placeholder. But you can see after just a couple of minutes, I've got the rough outline done, like so. And now it's time to refine the top plane. I was teaching a bunch of really accomplished furniture makers spoon carving. I wasn't teaching furniture making. I know nothing about it, but I was teaching furniture makers the other week, and I found that what really made sense to them was to talk about a reference plane, right? Because in furniture making, you establish one plane that sort of everything else hangs off of in terms of being square and true and yada, yada, yada. And the same is true of spoon carving. For me, I don't know how other people do it, but for me, it's this top face. And so this is my reference plane, and everything else happens in relationship to it. So at this part of the process, I'm refining that reference plane and getting it sort of as level as possible and as even as possible. But again, it's a process of refinement, so I don't bother getting it absolutely perfect. I just want to get it close enough that I can then sort of wiggle around within it and achieve something a bit tidier in the end. So now the nice thing about doing it the way I do in the wood, where this is the top surface of the wood and the handle comes down and the rim comes down, is that I can carve the handle down and all the rim cuts can go in. So everything comes into this spot right here and gets cleaned up fairly easily. So, okay, so now you can see that everything is lined up side to side wise. And now it's just a process of pulling up the underside so that I make the rim narrow enough that I can then refine the shape. I had a really interesting experience yesterday where I was teaching someone for the first time. This happened to me. I was teaching someone who just was really struggling to understand how her hands were supposed to grip the knife. And it was cool because it made me sort of push through all of the usual ways that I'd been describing how to grip the knife and sort of try out some new stuff, because what I was saying wasn't getting through. And it's like a really interesting process to be teaching someone and to be forced to confront your own assumptions about how clear you're being, because you clearly aren't being clear enough. And it was cool. I ended up coming up with some interesting ways of describing, how brands of knives that I'm using. This is a Mora 106 that's handled by Matt White. So I ended up coming up with, an interesting way of describing these cuts, the push cuts, where a lot of the power is coming from your thumb, because the truth is that the power isn't really coming from extending your thumb. If you do that, your thumb quickly gets tired. Really, the power is coming from changing the relationship of the wood to the knife, and the knife almost stays still, and you're almost moving the wood against the knife rather than moving the knife against the wood. It's a little bit by some of the pivoting cuts where the knife is clearly moving, but thinking about it as you're sort of holding the knife still against the wood as you're also with that same hand rotating the wood against the knife blade was helpful to her. What else was helpful to her? Oh yeah, there was I had to keep reminding her not to I did not say what I'm using. This is cherry. I had to keep reminding her to not let this thumb come off the back of the knife, because she kept wanting to, she would reach the end and then she'd want to switch and start using her arm muscles to continue that cut. Yeah, I have been using Tom Strops. So I'll talk about that in a minute. And so reminding her that this thumb needs to stay on the back of the blade the entire time was the breakthrough for me in realizing that it's not so much that this is moving back and forth, it's that this is holding still, this whole situation, and really you're moving the wood with your fingers underneath it. And that really that worked for her finally. She was able to understand that. And it was funny that I'd never had a reason to articulate it to myself that way, but I like it. I felt like it was helpful. So this is why I like teaching myself, is that I end up understanding the process better, and I become better over time at articulating it to other people. Okay, right, so somebody asked me about Tom Strops. Right, so I got a batch of a set of Tom Scandian's knife strops, and I've been using them, and I have to say, I rather like them. I made a post about this a couple weeks ago where I feel like if you're struggling with sharpening, stropping is not going to be a solution. The solution is to understand how to sharpen well and to understand what's happening in terms of the edge of your knife, both in terms of the edge geometry and in terms of the bevel geometry, and understand how you can achieve that. That being said, once you have that under your belt, stropping, I do think, is a valuable way to get a knife that performs even better, both in terms of the surface that it leaves and in terms of the ease of the cuts that you're making. So yeah, I've been super impressed with Tom Strops and would highly recommend them to anyone looking to take that step. But if you are struggling with sharpening and you're thinking that stropping is going to be the solution that solves your problem, I don't think that's going to be true. I think that you need to understand sharpening in its own right, and that no amount of additional stuff that you buy is going to help you with that knowledge. So I have laid out a bunch of stuff about sharpening in some videos. Matt has also laid out sharpening stuff in some videos. There's a lot of sharpening information out there, so spend some time trolling around and really educating yourself as best you can, because I've seen plenty of knives of people who come for lessons where they say, oh, I strop, and then it turns out their knives aren't as sharp as my knives not stropped because the edge geometry is not so great. Yeah, that's great that you can't get enough of them. Do you use stone or sandpaper to sharpen? I use sandpaper to sharpen. Yeah, I tried using stone. So here, check this out for a second. So if I leave this flat surface like this, that's a really high tail kick on there. So I'm going to lower this down to change the angle here. So I use sandpaper. I tried using stones for years, and water stones and some oil stones. I've done diamond stuff. Yeah, I really prefer sandpaper. It's cheap, it's very effective, and I like that it can all fit into my toolbox. Everything that I use, except for the stump and the club and the axe and the saw, are in there. And that way I have it with me always, and there's never the excuse of, oh, I'll get to that later when I'm home and I have my sharpening stuff available, which means that my stuff tends to stay sharper than it otherwise would. So that's being said, it's been a long time since I've had a chipped blade. I think the biggest thing you can do to stop yourself from having a nicked blade is to just get really consistent about putting that sheath on every single time you put it down. There we go. That's a better bottom. Okay, so now that I've pulled up the rim all the way around, and I've established the bottom plane in relationship to the top plane, and I need to adjust it side to side just a smidge. Now it's time to put the sheath on my knife, and then redraw the circular shape. Whenever I do this, I always spend a second and sort of squint at it and try and envision if this handle is in line with the circle that is the bowl. Because if I need to adjust the angle of the handle by, reducing the weight of it on one side or the other, now is the time to do it, rather than try and adjust the circle of the bowl. it's much easier to readjust the angle of the handle, and sometimes you can really change the shape that you can achieve simply by a couple degrees on the handle there. The other thing is to not get too distracted by these notches that I made, because those notches, you'll see when I draw the semicircular indents, you can sort of get close to them, you can be far away from them. So it's just a good idea to just kind of ignore those notches as much as necessary. And all right, so you can see that I didn't really get distracted by those notches. And now I'm drawing the circular shape. I've never drawn circles with a compass, in part because I've always felt that circles that are drawn with a compass kind of feel a little bit dead. It's not that to say that a perfect circle feels dead, but that when you draw a circle with a compass and then you try and carve to it with a knife, you inevitably aren't quite perfect about it. And so it ends up feeling less, like it has less energy than an imperfect circle that you've drawn that you've then trued up as cleanly as you can with a knife. So there we go. That's the scoop shape that I'm going for. So now I'll start with the handle. And largely that's because when I come down off the handle, I tend to pop into the rim just a tiny little bit. And I don't want to pop into a rim that I've already spent the time to cut cleanly. So I'll do it first. There we go. Thinking about holding the knife still and moving the wood against the knife is particularly helpful when you're cutting, when you're trimming like the end of the handle here, and you're trying to make a curve, which can be tricky. It can really help you make a nice smooth curve. To think instead of trying to move the knife, to think instead of rocking the spoon up against the knife blade. And similarly, when you're cutting these, any curves really, but finishing curves in particular, where you're trying to get a nice smooth line, thinking about rotating the spoon in your hand rather than moving the knife in a perfect arc can be really helpful. All right. So we got an inch or so of sleety snow yesterday, which I was worried was going to affect the fruit crop this year, the way it did a couple of years ago when we had a real cold frost and it just destroyed the peach harvest. But I guess it's been a cold enough spring around here that none of the fruit trees had really budded out yet, and so the weather didn't affect anything like that. Okay, so now I've carved around that outline, and I'm going to switch to a knife with the narrower tip to do these little bits in here. I always draw these little indentations a little bit smaller than I want them in the end, because they will always get a little bit larger as you're chasing sort of a nice clean look to them. So starting off with them being just a tiny bit smaller than you intend gives you room to expand them, and then you end up sort of right on the money what looks proportionally nice. Whereas if you tried to draw them perfectly the size you wanted and then achieve that with a knife, you would probably miss part of the time and end up making them a little too long. If that was your intent, was to keep them short. On the other hand, sometimes those happy accidents are how designs evolve. Okay, there's one side. I'm using just the tip of the knife. And another thing I had to show this woman yesterday was that when you're using just the tip of the knife, both of my thumbs are here closer to the handle, and then the tip of the knife is there. She was trying to put her thumb right behind where she wanted to be making the cut, and you just can't because your thumb doesn't have any power there because it's being lifted up by the wood. So you offset your thumbs, and that way you can have a lot of power by pulling the wood back against your thumbs there, even though they're offset and off to one side. So my thumb has room to go here. All right. Good girl, Willa. You're a good dog. I've been listening to an awesome new podcast, guys, called The Memory Palace. It's a podcast new to me. It's been around for years, by Nate DeMeo. And it's, if you like learning about history, in particular learning about history in a way that opens your eyes to think about the past, both as though it were much more like the present than we often think, and also to sort of learn something about the past that surprises you and makes you sort of reassess how you think about a particular part of the past. The Memory Palace is an amazing podcast. I'm able to find it just by searching within Spotify, but yeah, I'm sure you can find it online also and listen in a number of different ways. But I consume a lot of podcasts, and this is one of the best ones I've come across in a long time. So now that I have the shape carved to that line, now I need to redo the rim. And so again, I'm just carving a very shallow bevel that I don't try and do anything in the center of the bowl. Just a shallow bevel. And what I'm focusing on is how does that line look like when you view it from the side. Just like that. And here's another thing that I had to articulate to this woman. When you're doing this cut where you have it pressed into your chest and you're pivoting on these fingers, part of how you get the power, I realized, is actually from part of it's flopping your wrist. But if you don't have a lot of power in your forearm, you can get the same amount of power by actually keeping your hand a little stiff, pushing this hand out against these fingers, and then actually lifting your elbow and pushing out, and that rotates the knife down, or allows you to rotate the knife down with a certain amount of power that you otherwise wouldn't have. Okay, so now I'm just adjusting the side to side symmetry, make sure both sides have the same curve. And sometimes the easiest way to see that, is from the back. So you can look at it from the back and see that they have about the same curve. One thing I've been working to do is to bring more tool marks into my work, more sort of raw, unrefined tool marks. Except what I really want is not for the tool marks to be, I don't want them to come from a place of sort of sloppiness or lack of skill. I want them to come, they need to sort of sit within the piece within a framework that is as perfect as I can, so that the tool marks are coming from a place of real command of the situation, and not because I wasn't able to remove them, if that makes sense. And I've been inspired by this type of tool mark that I've seen in other makers for a long time now, but never quite felt like I always felt like I still needed to chase sort of clean forms and clean execution a little bit further before I could bring in these more expressive tool marks and have them feel the way I wanted them to feel. There's nothing wrong with bringing them in sooner than that, but that's just what I wanted to do. But I feel like I'm at that place now, which is really exciting, because it means that when I'm finishing the bowl of the spoon, sometimes I'll leave tool marks. Not always, but sometimes I'll leave tool marks just because they look good, just because they're bringing energy to the piece, to the situation. So that's been a really exciting development for me. Okay, so now you can see from here that this side needs to go down just a little bit. And now, I don't usually do it this way with other spoons. Usually I will finish the back of the spoon and basically do everything I can before I do the bowl. But with scoops, I found it more efficient to do the bowl, because the bowl of the scoop, more or less, is dictated by the diameter of the scoop. How deep I can go is dictated by the diameter. And so rather than try and figure that out and get it not quite right, I will instead just do the center, do the bowl, and then go back and trim the outside so that the weight of it feels right. Because otherwise I either end up with a clunky feeling scoop that has too much weight on the outside while the bowl is as good as it's going to be, or I end up with having to go back and trim up the outside for a second time. And that's just really inefficient. So can't even tell if anyone's still watching this. Oh yeah, 15. Nice. Thanks for being there, guys. All right. So good. So this is no exception. I always start my bowls right in the middle, and I want to sort of dive down in and establish a kind of a clean shape that I can then swirl around and around and around right away. So I'm always supporting it in the palm of my hand, and then swirling it around. And I've realized that the bulk of the carving with a hook knife is just it's changing directions all the time, but it's holding these two, your thumb and here, at the same distance from each other the whole time, more or less, and you're using your thumb to provide oppositional resistance against the knife. But as the knife comes around, I'm still providing oppositional resistance, and the whole thing's just swirling like that, right? So swirling around, swirling around, swirling around. I mean, I could go in spirals if I wanted to, but I don't, just because it's less efficient to keep changing direction. So instead I sort of do a bunch from this side, and then I flip it over in my hand, do a bunch from the other side. But you could achieve the same thing by basically just going in spirals and in spirals and in spirals, because everything is just about holding this at the same distance, and then using your thumb to help press back against the knife as it's diving down into the wood. If you don't have your thumb on the side there, you don't have nearly the power. You have to have some sort of oppositional support. So if you're backing off like this, then the oppositional support is really coming from here, pressing back against it. That to me feels less safe. It feels like if this popped free, then all of a sudden I'm going to cut myself right here. Or maybe I'm pressing back here and I'm not out of the way. At any rate, I find this sort of cut where I'm really choked up on the hook knife to give me the most control and power. And you really do, the more you're choked up like this, the more power you have. If you're back here trying to do what I'm doing, you're going to be stretching your thumb out too far and you're not going to have nearly the power. So put it with your forefinger right here on the spine of the blade, and you'll realize a lot more strength and power behind each cut than you've been experiencing before. So the goal is to sort of reach the depth that I want around the same time as I reach the rim size that I want. I'm swirling around and around, going out and out and out. One of the nice things about carving quickly is that you always are staying in fresh wood that hasn't had a chance to oxidize and harden up, because stuff like cherry and birch will harden even after exposure to air for an hour or two, and become dramatically harder to carve. So if you can carve something in a short period of time, if you can go from you can sort of keep constantly pushing underneath that layer of oxidized wood, or wood that's close to oxidizing, then you can maintain that speed because the carving is easier. You aren't hitting wood that is hardened up. So it's kind of a bit unfair in that the faster you are as a carver, the easier it is to be faster still, because the wood is pliant and easy to carve compared to if it takes you a while, which always seems very unfair, but it just is what it is. You could get around that, I suppose, by putting your spoon in a plastic bag and walking away for a little bit and letting it sort of rehydrate from the surface, from the moisture that's evaporating from within. You'll come back and you'll see that the inside of the bag is covered with drops of water as moisture is coming out of the wood. And then if it's held within the humid bag, that'll rehydrate some of the fibers at the surface. But really, there's no substitute for just being fast and staying underneath that layer of oxidized wood. All right. So now I'm getting awfully close to the maximum depth that I can hit with this diameter and this curve of knife. So now the goal is to just make sure that every cut is clean, so that if I need to walk away from the bowl and be done, I can. At the same time, I have a little more rim to go out to if I want to. So by expanding out to that rim, I open up the diameter, and that allows me to get down a little bit deeper. So it's nice to leave yourself a little bit of rim at the very end, almost as an insurance policy, so that if you got bogged down in some cut that didn't clean up, you could open up the rim that last little bit and hopefully get your knife down in there to clean it up. And then once you are are sure that the center is nicely cleaned up, then you can expand all the way out to the rim to get the rim the width that you want. And sort of ease that facet that you've made down into the curvature of the inside walls. But leaving yourself that little bit of rim at the end can sometimes get you out of a sticky situation where you think, oh, how am I going to clean up this cut? And then you realize it's because that you can do it because you can get that rim just a tad bit wider. So the one time I back off the handle here is when I'm doing a pivot with the tip like this, and then I'll back off the handle, and I'm not choked up on it quite so much. Now I no longer take measurements of my scoops. I used to measure them to make sure they were 2 tablespoons, yada yada yada. But I feel like now A, I have a pretty good eye for what that looks like, so I just do that. And B, I'm just not going to hold myself to that kind of a finicky standard because sometimes the scoop wants to be what it wants to be. And if that's 2 tablespoons and a quarter, well, you can figure that out when you make your coffee and adjust the next time you use that scoop. There's nothing sacred about a particular size. But that being said, they do roughly end up about the same size now. All right, so this is behaving itself very well except for this little bit of tear out right here. And whereas normally I would make this cut going down from the rim into the center, that little bit of tear out is telling me that if I can, I need to ghost up into it. Come at it from the other direction. Woo! Which is good. Now, as I get real close to that rim, I want to have my cuts be a little more cautious. Although if I'm going for visible tool marks, like I said, sometimes that might not be true, and I'm not going for cautious so much as just sort of bold, clean cuts. And I'm also going for the feel on the inside, by which I don't mean are there ridges, I mean is the curvature even throughout, so that when you're feeling the inside of the scoop, it has a really nice curve throughout. Alright, I made this rim just a tiny bit too narrow here, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to do the same thing on the other side, pull just a little bit too close to it, and that's going to allow me to lower this swoop in the rim equally on both sides, and it will create a rim that is exactly the width that I'm going for. And at a certain point, you gotta be done and willing to walk away. Not quite sure I'm there yet, though. Just want to do just a little bit more here. Okay. All right. So now Now I'm going to adjust that rim that got a little bit too narrow, and then I'm going to trim around the outside of the rim so that everything matches. There we go. So really I'm just making that rim look the right width from the top view by carving down into it just a little bit more. And go. And now I'm going to adjust the thickness of the rim. You can see there's a little bit of unevenness in the thickness, and this is the only time that I use this potato peeler and cut here. I find it's not very effective at getting smooth, clean cuts normally, but when I'm just trying to take off little peaks and be very precise about where I'm doing that, it's helpful because I can see exactly where I'm cutting. In this instance, I'm trimming the rim just the tiniest little bit, largely to remove pencil smudges, not really to adjust anything other than that. Okay, so now the last thing I do for the scoop, because I've already trimmed up the handle, trimmed up the back is leveled, I'm gonna ease these sides in. And over the years I've really toyed with a bunch of different ways of doing this. I'm just removing some pencil smudges here. That's the problem with the sapwood, really gathers the pencil dust in a way that hardwood doesn't. Over the year or so that I've been making a lot of these, I've tried lots of different styles of doing the outside. For at one point I did 5 large facets. Various times I've tried to make it very smooth. I've done sort of facets that all go up towards the rim. I've done ones where I've done sort of big chunky facets. Trying to find a balance between something that looked cool and also something that didn't take a ton of time to do. And what I found now is if the easiest thing to achieve, it looks good and doesn't take much time, is more, let's call it 80% smooth, where it's 80% of it is sort of really clean, but then there's some tool marks that I just haven't bothered to remove, that are sort of bold and still there. And that, to my eye, looks the best of all the options, because it's the least finicky, and as the least finicky carries the most energy, while at the same time, looking precise, and also sort of feeling it, allows me to sort of achieve the appropriate weight and feel of the wall of the scoop quite quickly, because you don't want the scoop to feel clunky. As I'm going around this, I'm starting off on the center here because I want this to be round, more or less. I've tried different shapes. Round is the easiest one to achieve. So I start by sort of defining that bit right there, and then I might go up to the upper rim and define how close to that upper rim I want to get. And then I attack the sort of bulk of material that's left in between and push it down to whatever curvature or thickness I find useful. right. Trying not to get bogged down in recutting these bits here, but inevitably you end up having to do a little bit of it because they aren't totally cleaned up. There we go. And whether or not, how clean you can get these little Phillips on the side has a lot to do with the wood and how forgiving it is, which generally means how hard it is. So a harder wood will clean up better, although it'll take more effort to do so. But it's also a mark of how sharp your knife is. And so if my knife isn't totally sharp, or if I'm using the blade that isn't quite as narrow, well then I won't end up with quite as clean a little spot in the neck there as I otherwise would. Ultimately, it is an area where you have to walk away from imperfections. And I've found that you don't notice them by the time you're done. So, that's true of so many things in life. I'm nearing being done here, guys, and I'm probably not going to show the process of burnishing and treating this, just because I'm going to move on to the next spoon I'm going to carve. You guys have any questions before I sign off? Now's your moment to ask them. Down to 7. All right, so okay, and there you have it. Finish scoop.